February of 1761, an audience in the Massachusetts State House was witness to a nearly 5-hour oration of fire and flame. Its orator would become known as the Patriot, and his speech would cause John Adams to recollect years later, quote, "Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, the child of independence was born. The seeds of patriots and heroes were then and there sown." And while many of our founding fathers would agree that this man was the spark that lit the flame of revolution, by the time the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, James Otis Jr. would be missing from the revolutionary cause, and his role in history would be nearly forgotten. James Otis Jr. was a key figure in American history. Though not called a founding father, I would call him a founding grandfather. His influential role on the founders cannot be understated. Hello history friends, and welcome back to my channel Historical USA. Here we discuss the people, places, and events that have shaped the fabric of America. Today we are going to be talking about an all-forgotten figure in American history, but a very important man, and that is James Otis Jr. We are going to discuss the writs of assistance and how Otis becomes the father of the Patriot cause. And we will also be discussing what happens to Otis and how just a few years later he will be tragically missing from the Patriot scene. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click that bell so that you will be notified anytime I post a new video. Before we begin, I just want to make a quick shout out to our Patreon members. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you would like to support the channel, you can find my Patreon link in the description below. Every member supports my work and allows me to do what I am doing, and I cannot be any more grateful for that. Also, we have chosen a book for July. If you want to be a part of the Historical USA book club, you can also go to my Patreon. It is free to join. You do not have to be a paying member to participate in the book club. It is a low maintenance book club. It is free. If you are looking for good historical books to read, go and lend your voice over there. We vote on a new book every month. There's a few discussion posts throughout the weeks, and all I can say is it's a good time and it's free. Now, James Otis Jr. is one of my favorite founding fathers, though he technically is not a founding father. It is Otis that will lay out the key arguments for what will become the Patriot cause. It is Otis that is also considered the father of the Fourth Amendment, and it is Otis that coins the phrase, "No taxation without representation." Otis is also the brother of one of my favorite, not just women of the American Revolution, but women through history, the poet and historian Mercy Otis Warren, who is also nicknamed the Muse of the American Revolution. So this family was incredibly important. I got a lot of my information from this book right here. It is called Minds and Hearts, and it is by Jeffrey H. Hacker, and I will have that linked in the description below. It is from my Amazon store. Any book that I use for any of my research on these videos, you can find on my Amazon storefront. It is an affiliate link. You don't have to buy it here, but if you are interested in any of the books that I recommend, that I am talking about, that I've pulled my information from, you can find those books in the description box below. Now, it is no secret that after the French and Indian War, the British government was in a lot of debt. Wars are kind of expensive. And even though victory was won, it was a hard-fought battle. And Parliament was looking to North America to recoup some of that loss. Now, there's a few ways that they will go about doing this, but one of the ways that they did that was to increase the payment of taxes on imports and curtail rampant smuggling. See, the American colonists were big on smuggling. There was a huge smuggling problem in the colonies, and Parliament and the Crown hoped to get a handle on the rampant, out of control smuggling. Now, what this did was they issued writs of assistance, which authorized custom officials to enter and search individuals' homes, their ships, their shops, their warehouses, unannounced and without a warrant. Okay, kind of a big problem, and really pissed the merchant class in Boston off quite a bit. Now, a young lawyer named James Otis Jr., whose father was actually very involved in Massachusetts politics, was educated at Harvard, and he was a student of Enlightened ideals. Now, we've gone through the Enlightenment, and if you want to check out that video when I'm talking about John Locke and the two treatises of government, you can check that out here, and I'll also have that linked in the description below. I am not going to go through John Locke's philosophy here, but we will touch on a little bit of it. Now, Otis was a huge believer of Locke, and he was a student of Enlightened ideas. He really believed in natural rights, and he firmly embraced a principle that a man's house is his castle. And he considered the writs of assistance as a violation of, quote, one of the most essential branches of English liberty, end quote. He would serve as an attorney for a group of merchants suing and challenging the new writs of assistance. Now, during the proceedings, Otis would make a name for himself, not just in Massachusetts, but around the colonies. Otis would stand and give a fiery speech that would last for at least 5 hours. Otis would base his arguments of this speech on natural law, the English Bill of Rights, and the constitutional principles of the British government. Although the law and precedent would favor the legality of the writs, Otis argued that the writs allowed unlawful search and seizure of property and violated the inherent natural right of people to feel safe in their home. Otis famously said, quote, one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, end quote. Now, unfortunately, there is no original text of Otis's speech, but luckily for us, we had a very brilliant lawyer sitting in the crowd that would, in years later, become not only a leader of the American Revolution and a leader of the Declaration of Independence, but our second president, and that was John Adams. John Adams, years later, would reconstruct as much of Otis's speech as he could recollect. And though Adams would enhance much of the speech on several occasions, Otis is the first leader of the period to develop distinctive American theories of constitutionalism and representation. Now, Otis's arguments would fail to win the case, but it would bring to light a few issues. Number one, the Chief Justice in this case would be Thomas Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson was born in Boston. He was a loyalist and would be appointed Chief Justice by the Royal Governor Francis Bernard. Hutchinson was also serving as the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. What we learned through the writs of assistance that there is a bit of corruption going on here. As Jeffrey H. Hacker writes in his book, Minds and Hearts, Governor Bernard was eager to enforce the Navigation Acts, a series of mercantile laws passed by Parliament to restrict colonial trade outside the empire. While it was his duty to implement Crown policy, the governor was entitled to 1/3 of the proceeds from any ship caught in violation. The customs agent in charge of the search was entitled to another third. Now, this appointment of Hutchinson's to the Chief Justice was a sore spot for Otis's father, James Otis Sr., who believed that he was the next in line to be Chief Justice. In Bernard appointing Hutchinson, who, by the way, had no legal training, was not a lawyer, did not go to school for the law, Bernard would kick the hornet's nest at precisely the wrong time in history. The choice of Hutchinson was a clear slight and showed Bernard's favoritism. James Sr. and James Jr. were furious, leading Hutchinson to write in his diary, quote, "The Otises were at the head of every measure in opposition, not merely in those points which concerned the governor in his administration, but in such as concerned the authority of Parliament, the opposition to which first began in this colony and was moved and conducted by one of them, both in the Assembly and the town of Boston. From so small a spark, a great fire seemed to have kindled." As I said, no official transcript of the case Paxton versus Gray, which is what the argument against the writs of assistance was based on. Otis would start his oration by saying, "I take this opportunity to declare that whether under a fee or not, for in such a cause as this I despise a fee, I will to my dying day oppose with all the powers and faculties God has given me, all such instruments of slavery on the one hand and villainy on the other, as this writ of assistance is. It appears to me the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty, and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book." Otis maintained that all general writs were illegal because they inherently threatened the liberties of British subjects. Hacker writes, "In at least 4 respects, he contended they were too broad to preclude officials from abusing power and abridging the rights of colonists. 1, they could be issued to any revenue of custom officials, who in turn could delegate authority to any other official, elected or not. 2, they did not expire and could be employed forever without accountability to a judge or magistrate." That doesn't sound very fair. And 3, they were not limited to a specific property and could be exercised at will without cause. 4, they allowed not only deputies but their menial servants to enter a private residence whenever they pleased with impunity. This, Otis thundered, violated a fundamental individual right. Quote, "Now only the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and while he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege." Having demonstrated how general writs threatened the rights of royal subjects, Otis would argue further that they were not only illegal, but unconstitutional. Here was a radical contention with far-reaching consequences, as he then called for the outright nullification of certain parliamentary acts, saying, "All presidents are under the control of the principle of law," he argued. "An act against the Constitution is void. An act against natural equity is void." On that basis, he insisted the court was compelled to consider all constitutional imperatives, including individual rights and privileges, in interpreting parliamentary statutes. In other words, he concluded the endangerment of personal freedom left the judge no choice but to reject the application of new writs of assistance. The implication of this pronouncement was profound, if not entirely fathomed in the moment. Here Otis was challenging the absolute sovereignty of Parliament and the king. If natural rights and constitutional principles supersede statutory mandate, which he insisted that they did, colonists across the empire might begin to question parliamentary authority. their own obligation to uphold the law, and their very allegiance to the crown. Thus, Otis taunted, quote, "If the King of Great Britain in person were encamped in Boston Common at the head of 20,000 men with all his navy on our coast, he would not be able to execute these laws. They would be resisted or eluded." Wow. Adams reported that Otis gave a dissertation on the rights of man in a state of nature. He asserted that every man was an independent sovereign. His right to his life, his liberty, no created being could rightfully contest. He asserted that these rights were inherent and inalienable. Sound familiar? That they never could be surrendered or alienated by idiots or madmen, and all the acts of idiots and lunatics were void. Kind of an ironic statement, considering what will happen to Otis years later. On that day, in 1761, however, his oration before the Superior Court galvanized all who witnessed it. As Adams wrote, quote, "Every man of an immense crowded audience appeared to me to go away as I did, ready to take arms against the writs of assistance." Everyone except for Hutchinson, who ruled that the writs of assistance were perfectly legal and fully supported by English statute, precedent, and practice. Custom agents would begin receiving the new writs of assistance in December of 1761. John Adams would write of his dear friend, James Otis, quote, "Otis was a flame of fire, with the promptitude of classical allusions, a depth of research, a rapid summary of historical events and dates, a provision of legal authority, a prophetic glance of his eyes into futurity, and a rapid torrent of impetuous eloquence. He hurried away all before him." American independence was then and there born. The seeds of patriots and heroes were then and there sown. Now, unfortunately, as I said, Otis would not be there to celebrate the Declaration of Independence, and he would not be there to sign the United States Constitution or any major founding document. By the late 1760s, James Otis would begin to display signs of mental illness. In 1769, Otis was struck on the head and his skull was fractured during an altercation with Boston's collections officer, John Robinson. Unfortunately, Otis would be rendered harmlessly insane, with only occasional lucid intervals the rest of his life. His family would do everything they could to make Otis's life peaceful and would leave him in the care of family friends in the country outside of Boston. He would frequently visit his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, who would take up the mantle her brother had laid for the patriot cause. On one of his visits to his sister, Mercy Otis, James described how he hoped to die, saying, quote, "My dear sister, I hope when God Almighty in his righteous providence shall take me out of time into eternity, that it will be by a flash of lightning." In 1783, God would take Otis out of time into eternity when he was struck by lightning. I hope you enjoyed today's episode on James Otis Jr. Let me know in the comments if you have heard of him before and what your thoughts are on today's episode. Have you heard of the writs of assistance? Have you heard that James Otis Jr. was the father of the Fourth Amendment? What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear from you guys and start a discussion in the comments. Thank you guys for watching. As always, remember to like this video, share, helps this video in the algorithm on YouTube. Make sure you smack that bell so that you will be notified anytime I post a new video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.